The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Stopped.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back, loving baseball when we were 12 and innocent. I'm Ralph Tycho of the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and my guest today is broadcast icon in the Bay Area, Joe Salvadore. Thank you for being here, Joe. It's about time I got it right.
Well, it's good to be here, Ralph. You know, finally we get to connect this way after
Absolutely.
Social media
Absolutely.
for so long.
Well, I want to start off by saying we talked a little bit off the air, and I'm excited to talk to a Sacramentoite. Originally, you were from there. I lived in Sacramento for a number of years, twice as a matter of fact, and I've got some very fond memories of Sacramento baseball at Renfree Field. Do you remember Renfree Field?
It's funny because when I was, growing up in Sacramento, they lost that, the Solons for about 13 or 14 years, from about 1960, I believe, to 73. And they ended up on that field, the original field, building a Gymco. And
oh, wow.
Which I assume is a Target. Most of them are. But in 1974, the Coast League brought them back, the Solons. They were affiliated with the Milwaukee Brewers, and they played at Hughes Stadium. And
right.
We went to a number of games there, and the first year, it's a football stadium, I'm sure you remember, it still is, and they tried to convert it to a baseball ballpark, and the dimensions were not quite up to speed, let's put it that way.
Didn't Gorman Thomas hit like 50 home runs with those dimensions?
Gorman Thomas hit over 50 homers. Tommy Reynolds, who later coached on Tony La Russa's staff with the A's during their pennant-winning years, he hit, I think, 30. Art Kushner, who was also a member of the La Russa staff, was the catcher, and he hit like 30 home runs. It was ridiculous. I think the average, Ralph, home runs per game that year at Hughes Stadium was about 7.
Wow.
And what they did is the Brewers would send their pitching prospects to, at that time, they did it sort of like the way baseball does it now with development. They would send their pitchers to Double-A because they didn't want their talented prospects shell-shocked by pitching at Hughes Stadium in Triple-A. So they had them, I believe, El Paso, which is not exactly a pitcher's ballpark either, pitched there as opposed to pitching at Hughes Stadium. So, Ed Farmer was on that. I mean, there were a lot of veteran the 4A guys or guys past their prime, but it was a lot of fun. It was, it was in Sacramento, which means we didn't have to drive to the Bay Area to go to a game. The weather obviously was always warm, especially from June on. And like you said, Gorman Thomas hit like 50 homers. There was a ball player by the name, and I played in the A system before that, and I'm drawing a blank, but he hit, I think he led the team in home runs. But no, it was a lot of fun, and it was unfortunate, Ralph, that they just could not build a ballpark in that era because the Brewers and then the Texas Rangers were the affiliate the last year in 1976. They led the league in attendance all 3 years, but because of the dimensions, they built like a Fenway Park Green Monster wall for the second and third seasons to make it a little bit tougher to hit a home run. Because I think I swear, were like 296 or something. I mean, it was something ridiculous.
Right. It reminded me of the old Coliseum in Los Angeles. It reminded me of, it was, dimensions were literally a hitter's ballpark.
And, it's funny because, growing up, we lived in Rancho Cordova. And that was all of Sacramento is a huge, or at least in the 70s, going back, was a huge baseball area.
It's a mecca. It's a mecca. The guys who have come out of Sacramento, including Dusty Baker, and you mentioned Rancho Cordova, one of my good pals and a frequent guest on this this network is Randy Lurch.
Sure.
And Randy just got into the Sacramento Sports Hall of Fame. And what made that cool is that Dusty Baker inaugurated, or whatever it was, he presented Randy and two great icons from Sacramento. There have been so many over the years. And the weather was, you could play ball pretty much all year round. So the youth programs were tremendous, and you get a little tear comes to my eye. Missing Sacramento, I didn't think that would happen.
Yeah, it was a great place to grow up at that time. You mentioned Randy Lurch, Max Venable, who
right, Maxie.
He was a hell of a football player. I believe he was a parade All-American at Cordova High as a running back. He probably would have. He had a longer career, obviously, as a professional ball player. Played, with the Giants and first came out of the Dodgers system. But if he had played in the NFL, he might have had maybe a shorter professional career, but maybe more well-known. Kind of the Ricky Henderson thing, where Ricky Henderson was a pretty good running back, but his mom did not want him playing football. But yeah, Max Venable, and at that time, Rancho Cordova was a very small community. So everyone kind of knew everyone. Jeff Jenkins, who later played for the Milwaukee Brewers, who's a little bit younger than me. He was living in our neighborhood as a little kid with his brother Brett, who played, I believe, in the Giants system. So no, it was a great, we'd play all till it got dark, out in the street. Right. It was definitely, when I moved to the Bay Area in 1979, it was different. And it was a little bit not as sort of Mayberry-ish, if you will.
Much less Mayberry-ish. Much less Mayberry. I know what you're saying. And the Mayberry thing isn't a knock. It's a way of life that's a little bit slower paced than the Bay Area is all. And
I know, Ralph, I'm wondering, I do have my aunt has, she's lived up there all her life. She lives in Citrus Heights now. But I'm wondering if it's still that way anymore. Because so many people have moved up there from the Bay Area and other parts, especially since the pandemic started. They've had a huge boom of residents move up to the Sacramento area. So it's probably, just like everything in life, Ralph, it's probably changed over the last few years. But when I was living there, at least, it was a very, as you mentioned, very slow-paced. And truthfully, even though we were living in the East Bay, in the suburbs, quote-unquote, when we moved here to the Bay Area, it still was faster-paced where I, even at 12, it seemed like I had to catch up a little bit.
Right. Your family moved to Richmond, am I correct?
Oh, no, we actually, I live in the Richmond district of San Francisco now. We looked at housing. My dad works in Silicon Valley, and even in 1979, that area was a little too pricey for buying a house. So we ended up living 1 year in San Ramon. So I went to 7th grade. I went to 7th grade at junior high there, and then my parents eventually bought a home in Livermore, where they lived for 36 years. So I went to Livermore High School, which there's one Hall of Famer that
Randy.
Yes, Randy Johnson, 6'9" and probably 170, maybe. He was like a pole, literally.
Randy Johnson is arguably the best starting pitcher of our time. And he gets so very little play in retirement. Have you noticed that?
Because he is, I don't know if you follow him on Instagram, Randy Johnson, but he is much more, even though it's social media, so it's not like you're physically seeing somebody, whether it's person, video, whatever, but he is just through his Instagram photo, because he's a big photography nut. He was that way in Livermore as a kid. But
really,
just through his Instagram post, he is much more outgoing than I think he ever was certainly as a child or a youth or a high schooler. But even as a professional athlete, he was kind of, now again, teammates have a different view, I'm sure, or people that played against him, because they're kind of in that fraternity. I'm talking about it as a professional ball player. But to the media, he seemed very aloof for his until he got to the Giants, which was at the end of his career. And a lot of players will open up a lot more when it's coming to the end of the line. But generally, throughout his career, he was not the most likable person. Remember, I don't know if you remember the 1 or 2 years he was in New York. There was that bit with Letterman where he, I think it was with the WCBS cameraman. He pushed the cameraman away.
Oh no, I don't remember that.
Oh yeah, it was not good. And again, Letterman kind of took off on it, and then eventually had him on the show, and they tried to make amends with the whole thing. But I mean, he was very, there was a period of time I remember he wasn't talking to the Mariners beat writers. I think it was '98, the lot before he got traded to Houston at the deadline. And I and another writer who covered him for the local paper in the Tri-Valley in high school, we both went up to try to talk to him in the Mariners clubhouse at the Coliseum after he pitched a game. And he told us he couldn't talk to us because he wasn't talking to the Mariners beat writers. So he couldn't, if he wasn't talking to them, he couldn't talk to us. So my point in this is, I think part of the reason he's not getting the recognition is the aloofness, I think.
Right.
Pitching in Seattle, pitching in Montreal or first before Seattle. I mean, they're not exactly media hotbeds. I mean, he pitched, like I said, those 1 or 2 years, I can't even remember how much, in New York, and he didn't pitch well there. He actually pitched better after he left New York again.
Was he happy coming back to San Francisco?
Yes. He was. Yes. He was very happy. His, he had some family still here. His father died quite a while ago. His mom was still alive at the time. And he had one other, I think it was a cousin who lived here, but it was just the idea of coming back to the Bay Area and pitching here. He would have loved it. He was an A's fan growing up, obviously. He was, in the East Bay, there's a lot of, pull for the A's. And I think he would have loved it for the A's. But, I think he was quite happy pitching with he seemed to be that year. And, of course, he won his 300th game that one year in Washington against the Nats. No, he was happy to be here. And he was much more accessible media-wise than I can remember previous to that. So, but anyways, his Instagram posts seemed to be very outgoing.
Good. I'm glad he's developed a personality. And
and I think a lot of players do that. I don't know. There's been a lot of, of course, everything is different now with the pandemic and the Zoom factor, which personally I don't think is going to go away. I think a lot of people, including station I used to work for, seem to think that once everything is lifted, that we're going to go back to clubhouses opening up to the media and us having that access. I don't think that's ever going to come back because the players don't want it to come back. They would have loved this, 2 years ago if this would have been an option. Because that is sort of their sanctuary, or where they perceive as their sanctuary. And I don't even see press conferences in sports. Now, news, obviously, it's happening even now, but I don't see even going into a room as a press conference room being a possibility anymore. I think the Zoom, at least in sports, and especially in baseball, I think the Zoom thing is here to stay.
How does a media person get a scoop in today's day and age?
You don't.
How?
You
okay.
don't. You don't, Ralph, unless you know the person well, and maybe you have their phone number. You can text them, and maybe you can get some response. And that is happening. I mean, this recent, when we're taping this is the day after the story about the A's and the city of Oakland.
We could do a podcast for a week about that. And
exactly. There are some of the writers, some of the beat writers did get some one-on-one responses. Now, they did say via text or via phone call, got quotes, that. But generally, that's the only way you're going to get a scoop or some type of one-on-one that is not a Zoom meeting. Right,
run-of-the-mill type thing where everybody gets the same story.
That's the thing that the media is missing over the last 14 months or whatever it's been, is going up to somebody sitting at their locker and talking to them one-on-one, or setting up a pregame interview or something of that nature. That's not happening. You only get whatever the PR department gives you. So normally, after games, you're getting, or pregame, you might get just the manager and maybe one player sometimes when they're home. After the game, if they lose, maybe you'll get one player with the manager. You're just not getting a lot of content anymore, and it's definitely run by the teams now. It's controlled more by the teams than it was before the pandemic.
Okay. Before we get to your age 12 and your fandom at that time, let me just ask you a blanket question about the recent rule changes and the proposed rule changes and how it's bastardizing our game, and what's your response? It seems to me that it gets harder for the fan, the average fan, to be a fan, and these rule changes aren't making it any easier. I'll give you an example when I say that, and that's the guy on second base in extra innings. That's the one that irks me to the point where if I think it's a tie, if I'm listening to a tie game, I have to be prepared to turn it off in extra innings. I refuse, unless it's the Mets. I'm a 73-year-old, 12-year-old myself. How about that? And so I just wanted your response. Is that, am I unusual?
No, Ralph, I agree with you 1,000%. I don't like it. I know they were doing this in the minor leagues for a couple of years before the pandemic. They tried to sell this originally as safety. I don't get that. It's the same thing with the 7-inning doubleheaders. That is, the longer they stay on the field, the more COVID could get around. I didn't understand that either, especially now with these, lifting restrictions, but yet, as we're taping this, again, the day before, a number of COVID cases were announced, including Fernando Tatis Jr.
Right, one of the
COVID,
up-and-coming superstars. Can they I remember last year when Freeman got it, another real outstanding baseball player, and I thought to myself, what is baseball going through? Why don't they just shut it down and not risk the careers and the lives of their most valuable assets? Wouldn't it be big? Last year was a horrible year, 60 games, this, that, and the other thing. I think if they would have said, forget the year early on and let's recover before we get on. And now all of a sudden it's opening up to the point where stadiums are starting to fill up. Are they doing it too soon? That's another question that comes to mind. Are they risking a setback?
Well, that's what I'm wondering, Ralph, because in California, we're supposed to open up at June 15th, is sort of the lifting of all the different tiers that we've been living through, the different colors, tiers. There's a report as we're taping this that Governor Newsom is going to lift the mask mandate pretty much on that date as well. My question is going to be, when you come to concerts and sports, is are they going to lift this either being fully vaccinated or showing that you've passed, if you will, a COVID test over the last 48 hours before you enter like a ballpark or going to a concert, which a lot of places are instituting now.
I know, but then people are forging that, and
this is not over yet. And the scary part of what we were talking about, Fernando Tatis and Phil Nevin, who is the third base coach of the Yankees. I don't know if Tatis was fully vaccinated. I know Phil Nevin was fully vaccinated, and he came down with COVID with the Yankees. So my concern is they call those obviously breakthrough cases. And we've seen that with Damian Lee of the Warriors, who also was fully vaccinated and came down with COVID. And I'm fully vaccinated, and I have the J&J vaccine, which most professional athletes have, because it's just easier to give them the one shot as opposed to the two. So from what I understand, the players in spring training, if they wanted to be vaccinated at that time, were given Pfizer, Moderna. When they came back to the different areas like the Bay Area, then again went to the J&J, and then when it was J&J was put on hold by the FDA, they went back to the Pfizer, Moderna. Then a couple of weeks ago, they went back to the J&J.
Joe, it's a possibility that these people who are coming down with it after being vaccinated, maybe they just weren't showing symptoms and they had it before.
Well, that's Tatis. Definitely, I know. I don't know about Phil Nevin, but Tatis was asymptomatic, and they still they're getting tested more than the average. People aren't really getting that test unless they're going to some function or traveling or something. People are not getting tested like they were a few months ago, but athletes are getting tested. And that's where this obviously was found, and he was asymptomatic. So by all accounts, he was devastated. So, and we're talking about Fernando Tatis Jr. He was.
I can imagine.
Just, because he had no symptoms, and that's why the vaccines do work as far as keeping you from getting literally deathly ill.
Right.
But you're still, we're still in this mode of, okay, are you contagious? Can you give it? Obviously, you must be, because we're going to try to keep you in seclusion while you get through this, because we don't want somebody who's not vaccinated to get, deathly ill.
And then comes the variants. We don't know how these vaccines protect you against that 100% yet. So these are scary times.
Yeah, it's all a work in progress. But I also think, going back to the original, we kind of got off topic, but I think baseball tried to push this through by saying that it was safety concerns, playing the 7-inning doubleheaders, doing all these different rules that they wanted to do anyways. They just it fell in their lap, so to speak, with a pandemic that, we can just say this is safer than keeping them out for 3.5 hours. But the games are not really that much shorter than they were pre-pandemic. So I think that's all BS.
And they're not baseball as they were either.
No,
as a traditionalist, it really makes me angry. I'm going to throw one more thing at you when we're talking about rule changes. You know what? They're experimenting in the minor leagues now, just like they experimented with the guy on second in extra innings. They're experimenting with a home run derby.
Yeah.
To replace extra inning games.
That is the worst. The worst of the worst.
Now, that's the worst of the worst. Once you think it can't get any worse, it gets worse. And my question is, what will it's rhetorical. When will the fan go, hey, enough's enough? That's, I'm just going to play my little simulated computer game where I could play teams in the 50s.
Ralph, I'm right with you on that. Literally right with you on that. I have stuff on my computer now. I think, again, it's one of these things where Major League Baseball is trying to figure out the younger demographic and what will keep them interested in the game of baseball on the major league level. And, maybe I'm a different generation. I mean, my kids like baseball. They go to games. They've gone to quite a few Giants and A's games in their young lives. But they are not into it as much as I was at their age. Like, by the time I was, they're 10 and a half. And by that point, I knew who was on every team. I had baseball cards. I understood the game. I could watch the game on television or in person and know what was going on. I think there's a lot of people who are twice my kid's age who don't understand the game. But yet they can tell you every defense that the 49ers have. But they couldn't tell you the bullpen pecking order or what is high leverage, guy that's pitching late innings. And I can't and the thing that gets me, Ralph, is it's much harder, I think, to learn all of the defenses in the NFL than understanding a bullpen in Major League Baseball or the rules of Major League Baseball. It seems like that would be much more work, right?
What made us fans was the lore of the game. And we're seeing players to compare to, like, what was Ted Williams like as opposed to Barry Bonds. We can't do that anymore because they've skewed the record book where you can only compare players to the generation they're playing in now. There's no way to compare a player to how it was in the 50s or pre-Jackie Robinson and this. And baseball isn't making available their I don't know. The Giants do it well. They have a wall of fame, and they honor the players that have been there. But not many teams do that. And
Ralph, the problem with Major League Baseball is they don't even want their history shown. Like, if you post there are YouTube channels that try to post old games, and Major League Baseball has been quick to pull them down. And I'm not going to give out any channels that are existing because I don't want them to lose their channels. But they eventually, some of these people will try to go bypass the algorithm of YouTube, let's say, to post these games. And again, that going back to what you're saying now is part of the problem. Is why don't they want these things shown? Why don't they want them out there? The NFL, when things like YouTube started 15 years ago or so, they put all their stuff on YouTube. I believe the NBA also did a lot of stuff early on. They got on the YouTube bandwagon and posted old videos and games and stuff. I don't understand why baseball doesn't want to embellish its history in that form, because that is if you're trying to get the younger demographic, okay, and they do want to say, let's say, I'd like to see Hank Aaron or Ernie Banks, or I'm not talking, there is some Babe Ruth out there. I'm talking players that maybe from the era where there's not a lot of old 20s video.
Right.
That somehow Major League Baseball is allowing to be shown everywhere. They're interested, and that's how you get through to them. And I know there's a couple of things on Twitter. There's a couple of sites that do post, run to 2-minute videos, which is fine, which is good. Anything is better than nothing. But if you're trying to get younger demographics, this is what they do. They look at things online. They look at Instagram or videos or, but to say, oh, no, that's our, we own that domain. Okay, great, you own that domain. But to not share it, I think, is also hurting trying to get people invested in the game. Well,
the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network shares all of their offerings on YouTube. So I've got 2,500 plus offerings that are readily available. Go to the Comfortably Zoned channel, everybody, and you can hear people like Joe Salvadore. Joe, let me ask you this. I'm kidding around now, but what was the thing when you were 12 that really got you? You're a kid, you're learning it. What was the hook for you?
That's a good question. I think early on I played, you played a little bit of baseball as a kid. You played in the street, obviously. We used to play pickle. We would do all those things. But as far as I guess it was my dad. That was really the hook because he was a big baseball fan. He grew up in Rhode Island, so he's a huge Red Sox fan. He and his dad, my grandfather, used to go to every weekend. I think they had season tickets, or they at least had tickets where they would go every weekend. And so my dad saw Ted Williams play from the time I think my dad was 5, his rookie year. So he
1939.
Yeah. So he saw him play all the way, all through years till he went to Korea after World War II. He was there the day, Babe Ruth Day. He remembers them piping in Babe Ruth's speech at Fenway, which they did at the time. All the ballparks in 1948 piped in I think it was Mutual, I'm not sure, that carried it. And he still remembers that, being at Fenway for that. So his love of the game, I think, obviously was passed down to me. And so like I mentioned earlier about the Solons, and then we went to Giants and A's games. We would try to go, when we were living in Sacramento, it was a little harder. So we probably went once a month during the baseball season. And then when we moved down the Bay Area, it was obviously easier to get to both ballparks. And so we started going. We're going to talk about 1979, which was when I was 12. I went to the second lowest attended game of the A's that year. The A's that year drew 306,000 for the entire season. And
they were the Mitchell Page A's.
Yes, they were the Mitchell Page A's, and it was the year before Billy Martin came, and it was September when we went to the second lowest game. We had been here maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and when you move as a kid, it's tough. You lose all your friends. My kids, it's much different today because my kids had a bunch of, actually quite a few friends leave. We're talking about going to Sacramento. A lot of people left the Bay Area during the pandemic, but they can still keep in touch because of the internet. When I was a kid, we didn't obviously have that, so it was tough. You didn't know anybody. I was in junior high, and they started junior high in the Bay Area in the 6th grade. In Sacramento, it starts in the 7th grade. So I had gone from 6th grade from elementary school to junior high and moved. And so it was just a really difficult experience the first couple of weeks of the school year. And so my dad took me we went to an A's Rangers game, and the attendance that night paid was something like 750, I think.
Oh,
but that
wow.
was paid, and there was less. I would say in that ballpark that night was about 200. And we sat in section 117, which is right behind the plate.
Right.
And I remember, because we had gone earlier that year when we were still in Sacramento, we drove down, my dad and I came down to a Yankee-A's doubleheader on a Friday night, twilight doubleheader. They had 19,000 that night. That was the biggest crowd. So I went to the biggest crowd that year and the second smallest crowd. And
at age 12.
Yeah, at age 12. And they were not, the 19,000 game, they were not prepared. We stood in line. The game started at 6:05. My dad always, we would always get there when the gates, back in those days, the gates opened 2 hours before first pitch. That way we could see some of the batting practice for the home team and then the visitor batting practice. And we stood in line for 90 minutes to get it. There was one gate open, and we didn't get in until 5:30. And my dad, I can still to this day, he was so upset. He hated, Charlie Finley, right, by this point. And none of them, one concession stand open. The wall was padded the A's bullpen in the left field was padded along the wall. But the actual outfield wall was wood, and it was not padded. The scoreboards were broken. Roy Steele, the longtime PA announcer, would make an announcement that the scoreboard's inoperable at this time. And I mean, it was when you tell people this today that weren't alive or living here at the time, they don't believe you. They don't believe that something could have been this antiquated 40 years ago. And it was like, yeah.
And 40 years later, they're still in the same stadium, and it's still antiquated. And this is the week that baseball really came down on the A's and said, find yourself a new home if you're not going to get it right. What do you think the chances are of them developing that property near Jack London Square rather than using the existing area by the Coliseum with transit that's intact? Everything's there. You can get to it. You don't have to disrupt the city. What do you think the chances of them ever building a baseball field, and will they move? Your prediction.
Well, Ralph, there's two ways to look at this. My heart would, having grown up in Northern California, I would hate to see any of the teams leave, especially, when the Giants were threatening to leave back in the early 90s to go to Tampa Bay. We had that situation until
Toronto as well.
Yeah, I was a kid, 1976 or 75. So you obviously would love them to stay. But I don't know if it's going to be feasible. Well, the Coliseum site is completely out. I mean, Major League Baseball in that announcement said that is not a feasible option, the whole land. Because I think there was some confusion yesterday, the day we're taping, day before we're taping, a comment from Major League Baseball on that. It's not just the actual ballpark that's been in existence. They're talking the whole land is not feasible. So there's no ballpark ever. In fact, Dave Cavill made that clear the last 2 days, that no ballpark will be built on the Coliseum site. So it is either Howard Terminal or, as he puts it, bust. The problem there is, they keep saying it's privately financed, but then when the fact term sheet, which is what Major League Baseball and the A's are asking the city council to vote on, it's not all privately funded. I mean, if you read it all, there's a lot of money that's being put up that the A's want paid back to them. And so there's the issue of where's that money, really going to come from? And that's the big sticking point in this. The other sticking point is, according to Cavill, the city of Oakland has told him because of the pandemic, they lost a whole year. Originally, the plan was...
The proceeding has been a comfortably zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.